The Appalachian Trail in early March, right after an ice storm, is no joke. We learned that the hard way. It was supposed to be a relatively straightforward trip. Just a section hike, nothing crazy. Me and my two buddies, all of us 21 and in decent shape, planned for a weekend in the wilderness. The forecast predicted mid-40s, a solid temperature for a good hike. The storm had hit a week prior, but we figured that would be enough time for conditions to improve. We were wrong. The first few miles were manageable. The snow was packed down in some areas, but still loose enough in others that every few steps we would sink in about half a foot. Annoying, but nothing we couldn't handle. The trail twisted through the leafless forest, the sun cutting through the bare branches, reflecting off the white powder in a way that made it feel almost peaceful. If anything, it gave us a false sense of confidence. Then we hit the deeper snow. Knee-deep at first, then waist-deep in some spots, with a thick layer of ice crusting the top. Every step was a battle. We had to lift our legs high just to take another step forward, and half the time, the ice would break under our weight, sending us crashing through the surface. There was no rhythm, no way to move efficiently. Each step required strength we didn't realize we would need. Our plan had been to check the mile markers and reassess the situation if it got too difficult. But we never saw the next marker. It was buried under feet of snow. By the time we had slogged through 2 more miles of the icy mess, we had passed the point of no return. Turning back was just as daunting as pushing forward. The map told us we should be only a mile away from a shelter. That knowledge was the only thing keeping us going. What the map hadn't shown, however, was that the shelter was actually another mile off the main trail. That realization didn't hit us until much later, when we were already beyond exhaustion. The sun was sinking, and our legs were barely functioning. My calves were locking up, my thighs seizing with every step. My friends weren't doing much better. Each time one of us had to stop to stretch out a cramp, it got harder to start moving again. But stopping for too long wasn't an option. The cold would creep in fast, and without tents, we had no choice but to make it to that shelter. The last stretch felt impossible. The snow swallowed our feet with every step, and the ice made everything unpredictable. Sometimes it would hold our weight, other times it would crack, sending us plunging into the deep snow beneath. My hamstrings cramped so badly, I had to stop and force my legs to extend before I could take another step. It was hell. We made it to the shelter just before sunset. I don't even remember the last 100 yards. It was a blur of pain and exhaustion. My legs were trembling as I dropped my pack inside. My buddies collapsed onto the wooden floor, panting like we'd just run a marathon. We needed water, and we needed a fire, but neither task felt doable. The water pump, which should have been a quick and easy source, was barely functional. Every step toward it sent a jolt of pain through my legs. My hands were shaking as I worked the handle, and it took what felt like forever to fill our bottles. The fire was worse. Our bodies screamed with every movement, but we had to get something going. The air was rapidly cooling now that the sun was down. We managed to scrape together enough dry kindling, but our fingers were stiff, and every attempt to light the fire felt like it was happening in slow motion. Finally, after several failed attempts, the flame caught. It was small, weak, but it was something. That night was agony. Our muscles were fried. Every shift in position sent cramps surging through our legs. I could barely stretch my legs out without them locking up. Sleep came in brief, miserable stretches. The temperature dipped lower than expected, and despite our layers, the cold seeped into our bones. By morning, we were in bad shape. My calves felt like they had been torn apart. My thighs were no better. Moving at all sent a wave of pain through my entire body. My friends were in the same condition. We sat in silence, knowing we were in trouble. Then, the forecast changed. Freezing rain was supposed to start by noon. 7 miles still separated us from the nearest trailhead. There was no way we were making it out in our current state. Even if we pushed through the pain, the ice storm would turn the trail into a death trap. We had no choice but to call for help. None of us wanted to do it, but there was no alternative. With barely functioning legs and worsening conditions, waiting for a ranger was the only option. It took time, but eventually they got to us. They weren't thrilled about it, but they understood. When they saw the condition of the trail, they admitted it was worse than expected. The ride back felt like defeat, but at least we were safe. It had been a brutal lesson. We had underestimated the ice, the snow, and the trail itself. The mountain didn't care how fit we were or how prepared we thought we had been. We got lucky. It could have ended much worse. The next few days were spent recovering, our legs barely functioning. Every movement was a reminder of how bad it had been. But even now, looking back, the biggest takeaway is simple: respect the trail. Snow and ice change everything. If there's been an ice storm recently, be very, very cautious. And never assume the conditions are as easy as they look on paper. It was late October, and I was out on a solo hike in the East Tennessee backcountry, deep in a stretch of private land owned by a rich friend of mine. His property bordered the national park, and he had told me I was free to roam wherever I wanted. I had been hiking all day, completely off-trail, just meandering through the thick woods, following ridgelines and cutting through narrow hollows. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't run into another soul unless they were deliberately looking for you. That's exactly what I liked about it. The air had a crisp edge to it, the kind that signaled winter wasn't too far off. The leaves had mostly changed, brilliant reds and deep oranges hanging onto the branches, while a thick carpet of brown covered the forest floor. The sun had been setting earlier and earlier, and by the time I decided to set up camp, it was already dark. I picked a flat spot near a small clearing, cleared the area of loose leaves, and got a small fire going. Just enough to keep the chill off, nothing too bright. After setting up my small tent and making sure my gear was in order, I sat back against a fallen log, packed a bowl, and let my mind drift. It was one of those moments where everything just felt right. The fire crackled softly, the air was cool but not uncomfortably so, and the woods were alive with their usual nighttime sounds. Distant hoots from an owl, the rustling of small critters in the brush, the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. I don't know how long I had been sitting there, fully relaxed, deep in a kind of meditation, when the first scream ripped through the night. It was loud, unbelievably loud. A high-pitched, guttural, furious scream, somewhere between a wild animal and something entirely unnatural. And it was close, real close. My eyes snapped open, my body locked in place. I hadn't moved an inch, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound had come from directly across the fire, maybe 30 feet away. For a few seconds, I couldn't do anything but sit there, frozen, every hair on my body standing on end. I wasn't sure if I had even been breathing. My first thought wasn't to run or yell, it was just pure, blind terror. My mind struggled to process what I had just heard. Then it screamed again. That snapped me out of my paralysis. I didn't move suddenly, some deep, primal instinct told me not to. Instead, I slowly reached down and unzipped my pack, pulling out my 9mm. I kept it low, resting on the ground beside me, while my other hand reached for more sticks to feed the fire. I had been keeping it small on purpose, but now I didn't care. I tossed everything I could reach into it, watching as the flames leapt higher, casting more light into the surrounding trees. I sat completely still, my gun resting in my lap, waiting. My eyes scanned the woods beyond the fire, but I couldn't see anything. The screaming had stopped. I listened, really listened, but all I could hear now was the crackling fire and my own breathing. Then, maybe 5 minutes later, another scream, this time from my left, much further away. I kept sitting, unmoving, still gripping the gun in my lap. Another 5 minutes passed, and I heard it again, even further out. It was moving away from me. The fear slowly started to fade, replaced by curiosity. What the hell had just screamed at me? I ran through a mental list of everything it could be: fox, bobcat, coyote. But none of those quite matched what I had heard. And then it hit me. A screech owl. I exhaled, feeling both relief and embarrassment wash over me. It had to be a damn screech owl. I'd heard them before, but never that close, and never while sitting alone in the dark after getting stoned. The relief didn't come all at once, though. My nerves were still shot, my body still keyed up. I kept the fire going a little longer than usual, just to be sure, before finally crawling into my tent. Even after I lay down, my heart took a while to slow. The adrenaline had been dumped into my system hard, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. Every little sound outside had me alert, listening. But nothing else happened that night. Eventually, I fell into a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up stiff and exhausted. I packed up my gear, put out the fire completely, and started hiking again. The daylight made everything feel different, safer. It was funny how something could feel so terrifying at night, but seem so stupid in the morning. A damn owl. I shook my head, half laughing at myself as I walked. But the hike wasn't over yet. Sometime in the afternoon, I was walking through a dense patch of mountain laurel when I spotted something through the gaps in the branches. A person. Another hiker. My stomach dropped. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something different, an uneasy, sinking feeling. I was miles from anywhere, on land that wasn't open to the public, completely off trail. Whoever they were, they shouldn't have been here. And worse, they hadn't seen me yet. I dropped low, crouching behind the laurel. I watched them for a moment, trying to gauge whether they were just passing through or if they were looking for something, or someone. They moved slowly, looking around, adjusting their pack. It didn't seem like they were lost, and they weren't acting suspicious. Maybe just another guy who had wandered too far past the park boundary. Still, I didn't want to be seen. I waited until they moved on, staying perfectly still, barely breathing. Once they were out of sight, I waited another 10 minutes just to be safe before moving again. I took a different route back, circling wide to avoid running into them. When I finally made it back to my truck, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors out of habit. Sitting there for a moment, I let out a deep breath and shook my head. A screech owl and another hiker. Two of the scariest things I'd ever encountered alone in the woods. And between the two, I honestly couldn't decide which one had freaked me out more. I spent 3 months in the backcountry of the Talkeetna Mountains in Alaska about 15 years ago. It was one of the most intense, isolating, and humbling experiences of my life. The wilderness up there is vast and unforgiving. Endless stretches of tundra, towering peaks, and thick forests, all hiding creatures that could kill you in an instant. The mountains were wild, and the rivers ran fast and cold. There were no roads, no rangers, no way to call for help if something went wrong. You were on your own. I thought I had prepared for everything, but nothing could have prepared me for that one night. It must have been early July, right in the heart of the season where the sun barely dipped below the horizon. Even at 3 in the morning, it was bright enough outside that you could see the outline of the mountains in the distance. That night, I had gone to sleep in my tent with 3 other guys, exhausted from a long day of hiking and setting up camp. Our group had settled in a valley, surrounded by rolling hills covered in thick brush. We had seen bear tracks earlier that week, but no actual signs of one close to camp. We had been careful, hung our food properly, cooked away from the tents, and did everything by the book. But none of that mattered when I woke up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding out of my chest, panic flooding every inch of my body. There was no sound, no reason I should have woken up. I wasn't having a nightmare. I had just jolted awake into raw, unfiltered terror. My body felt locked in place, my breathing sharp and shallow. It was like my instincts knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. Then I heard it, a deep, slow exhale, the unmistakable sound of something massive breathing just outside the thin fabric of my tent. My eyes darted around, barely able to make out the shapes of my 3 tent mates, all still sound asleep. My pulse hammered so hard I thought it might shake the tent. I turned my head slowly, staring at the wall of the tent closest to me. The light from the midnight sun cast a dim, ghostly glow through the nylon fabric, just enough to reveal a massive shadow pressed against the side of our shelter. The shape was unmistakable, broad shoulders, thick neck, long snout. A grizzly, a behemoth of an animal, its sheer size overwhelming even in shadow. I could see the way it moved, slow, deliberate, sniffing. It let out another breath, a strange mix of a huff and a grunt, the sound so deep I felt it in my chest. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. My body had gone cold, locked in that primal, helpless fear. The kind of fear that makes you feel like prey. I knew running was useless. If I bolted, it would be over in seconds. Screaming wasn't an option either. I was trapped in a fragile sheet of fabric with 3 other people, and none of us stood a chance if this thing decided to come crashing through. It pawed at the tent, pressing its weight gently against the fabric, as if testing it. The nylon flexed, bowing inward, and I held my breath, convinced that any second, those massive claws would tear through and pull me out. It huffed again, the sound carrying weight, vibrating through the air. Then it started circling. I heard the crunch of its paws in the dirt, the heavy shift of its body moving around us. Each step was deliberate, slow. It was curious, maybe hungry, maybe just investigating. But curiosity alone from an animal that big was enough to kill. My fingers dug into my sleeping bag, my breathing shallow, barely daring to move. I thought about the stories, people being dragged from their tents, mauled, their bodies found torn apart in the brush. The stories were always brutal. A grizzly wasn't just a predator. It was a force of nature. The bear stopped moving. The breathing stayed close. It sat, just sat, right next to the tent, and time stretched. It could have been 10 minutes. Could have been an hour. I didn't know. It felt like eternity. My mind raced through scenarios, but every single one ended the same way, with me dead. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, every muscle in my body stiff with tension. My mouth was dry, my tongue stuck to the roof. It was so close, too close. Then, finally, it rose to its feet. It sniffed again, a deep, heavy inhale, as if memorizing our scent. And then, just like that, it walked away. I didn't breathe until the sound of its footsteps faded. Even then, I stayed frozen, my muscles locked, my body still refusing to move. I wanted to wake the others, to make sure I hadn't imagined it, but I was afraid. Afraid that any movement might bring it back. I lay there, listening. The bear had moved toward the other tents. I heard more sniffing, more huffing. The same slow, careful steps. A part of me felt ashamed for thinking it, but I was relieved. Relieved that if something happened now, it wouldn't be me. But nothing happened. Eventually, it just left. Vanished back into the wilderness, slipping away as silently as it had come. When morning finally came, I crawled out of my tent, my body sore and exhausted. The others stirred awake, stretching, yawning, completely unaware of what had happened. I stepped out into the cold morning air, my breath visible in the light. And then I saw them. Massive paw prints. Deep impressions in the mud, circling the tent. Huge, clawed tracks leading away toward the brush. My stomach turned. Seeing the evidence of it, knowing just how real it had been, sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I looked around at the others, still groggy, rubbing their eyes. They had no idea how close we had come to disaster. I thought about telling them, but what would I say? That death had sat outside our tent last night, breathing, waiting, deciding? I never slept the same after that. Not in the backcountry. Not with those mountains around me, the rivers whispering, the endless stretch of untamed land hiding things bigger, stronger, faster. Somewhere out there, that grizzly still walks. And it remembers. We had just finished our shifts at Sleeping Giant Provincial Park, exhausted, but excited for some solitude. After spending weeks surrounded by over a dozen other staff members, my coworker and I decided to skip the staff party and take a backcountry camping trip. Just a few days, just us, the wilderness, and some peace and quiet. We were so eager for it that we sang as we hiked, our voices echoing through the trees. The hike was long, but we didn't mind. It took about 3 hours to reach our first campsite. The forest was thick, but the air smelled fresh, and our packs, heavy at first, became more bearable as we adjusted to the weight. The occasional mosquito buzzed around us, but we barely noticed. We had bug spray. We were prepared. When we finally arrived at our site, the first thing we heard was shouting from the lake. A couple was already there, and they were frantic. We couldn't make out their words at first, just the urgent tone of their voices. We walked closer, trying to understand what was going on. Then we heard it clearly. "It's okay if you freak out." The man's voice was desperate. "Just run," the woman screamed. I turned to my friend, confused, but before I could say a word, I saw it. Her neon green shirt was nearly black under a thick, shifting mass. Flies. I barely had time to process what I was looking at before I felt them on me too. My arms, my neck, my scalp. I looked down, and my skin was gone, replaced by a writhing, biting swarm. Panic took over. We dropped our packs and bolted for the lake. My boots pounded the ground, the buzzing filling my ears, my body on fire with thousands of tiny bites. My skin crawled with the sensation of their tiny legs clinging to me. Lake Superior is famously cold, but when we dove in, the water was warm. Or maybe I was too numb to feel the cold. For a moment, I thought we were safe. But then I felt them still clinging to me, biting, even underwater. We had to scrape them off with our hands, peeling away the stubborn ones that refused to let go even as they drowned. They died still latched onto us. The couple in the lake with us watched, their faces pale. They had been through it already. We knew the flies weren't leaving anytime soon, so we decided to wait it out. Maybe they would die down as the sun set. Maybe the evening chill would drive them away. As dusk settled, the woman in the couple decided she needed to get out. She hesitated, but finally stepped onto the shore. Within seconds, she was swallowed by the swarm. Her partner panicked, yelling for her to come back to the water. She refused. She had a plan. We watched as she fought her way to the campsite, waving her arms wildly, her face twisted in pain. She grabbed what she needed and managed to start a fire. Smoke billowed up, and the flies backed away. Slowly, she created a bubble of safety around their camp. Her partner finally worked up the courage to leave the lake and join her. We thought we were being smart too. We covered ourselves in thick lake mud, caking it over every inch of exposed skin. If they couldn't reach our skin, they couldn't bite us. Feeling invincible, I told my friend to wait in the water while I went to set up camp. I warned her not to panic, no matter what, because I wouldn't be able to handle it. She promised she wouldn't. She lied. The moment I stepped out of the water, they were on me again. The mud did nothing. Neither did our industrial-strength bug spray. The swarm was relentless. I could feel them crawling into my hair, under my shirt, in the folds of my clothing. I grabbed our bags and ran. I ran blindly, following the trail to the nearest junction, where I knew the flies weren't as bad. The buzzing was deafening. I could feel them wriggling between my fingers as I ran my hands through my hair. Every inch of me was alive with biting, clinging insects. I broke. I started screaming, smacking my own body, trying to kill them. I hate killing bugs. I never wanted to kill anything, but at that moment, all I wanted was for them to stop. I felt like I was losing my mind. I yelled for my friend to stay in the water. She did. I gathered everything, my hands shaking, my skin raw. When I had what we needed, she met me at the trail junction. We couldn't stay there. We couldn't go back. The only choice was to leave. We made dinner right in the middle of the trail, using an illegal fire pit someone else had left behind. We just needed to eat, to regain our strength, to wait and hope the flies would die down. I put on my loose nightshirt, my pajamas. As we ate in silence, our bodies stinging, our nerves frayed. A family passed by, people we had checked in earlier that day. They stopped, looking concerned. "Are you okay?" the father asked. We smiled, nodded. "How was your hike?" I asked. His daughter, maybe 8 years old, pointed at my mud-streaked nightshirt and said, "I like your dress." They moved on. We waited until nearly 11 p.m., but the flies never left. There was no choice. We had to go. So we hiked back, in the dark, through bear and cougar country. Our only defense was singing, loud and off-key, hoping our terrible voices would scare off any predators lurking in the shadows. By the time we made it back to our cabins, it was nearly 2:30 a.m. We stepped inside, exhausted, our skin crusted with dried mud and blood, our hair tangled and half-wet. The party was still going. Everyone was drunk, celebrating the end of the season. We dropped our bags. We grabbed beers. We never spoke about it in detail after that. We laughed it off when people asked why we came back early. But for years, the sound of a fly buzzing near my ear sent my heart racing. I've faced wildlife, injuries, even a bear crashing into my tent, but nothing, not one thing, has ever been as terrifying as those flies. I have always been someone who prefers solitude when hiking. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that makes me feel more connected to it. No distractions, no noise, just me, the trail, and the silence. But that changed on a late autumn afternoon in the Cascade Mountains, when I realized that some silences aren't natural. It started as an ordinary solo hike. I had planned a long but straightforward trek along a remote trail that I had been meaning to explore for a while. It wasn't one of the well-traveled paths with groomed switchbacks and signs at every turn. This was one of those routes you only find if you really go looking, something you might spot on an old Forest Service map or hear about from a seasoned hiker. The trail wound deep into the forest, past towering Douglas firs and dense patches of ferns, following an old logging road before tapering into something less defined. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the remnants of a recent rainstorm still clinging to the underbrush. For the first few miles, everything felt normal, peaceful even. Birds flitted between branches, their calls mixing with the rustling leaves overhead. I kept a steady pace, my boots crunching softly on the damp soil. But as I got deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest started to change. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The birds were still there, the wind still whispered through the trees. But something was off. The usual background hum of insects, the occasional scurrying of small animals, gone. Just an odd, muffled stillness that made my skin prickle. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just a shift in the temperature or a natural quiet spell in the late afternoon. But then I saw him. A man, standing off the trail, partially obscured by the trees. He wasn't a fellow hiker. He wasn't carrying a backpack, and he wasn't dressed for the terrain. He wore a gray hoodie, not waterproof, not insulated for the cold. His jeans were faded, loose-fitting. His shoes were wrong too, black sneakers, worn down, dirty. Not the kind you'd wear for hiking deep into the mountains. He was just standing there. Not moving, not adjusting his stance, not acknowledging me. His posture was unnatural, too rigid, his arms hanging limply at his sides. And the way he was positioned, half behind a tree, not quite hidden but not fully visible, it wasn't normal. I glanced at him quickly, then turned my eyes back to the trail, pretending I hadn't noticed. The last thing I wanted was to make eye contact with someone who might not be mentally stable. I kept walking. My pace quickened slightly, but I forced myself not to run. I told myself he was probably just some guy camping illegally, maybe a drifter passing through. There were all sorts of reasons someone might be in the woods alone. But then, a quarter mile up the trail, I saw him again, standing farther ahead. There was no way, no possible way he could have moved ahead of me without me hearing him running. And I never heard a single footstep. This time, he was closer to the trail, less hidden. Still standing, still watching. A sharp wave of cold ran down my back. I wasn't alone. And whoever this man was, he was playing some kind of game. I kept moving, my heart thudding in my chest. I forced myself to think logically. Maybe there were two of them. Twins, maybe, or just two men dressed the same. It was unlikely, but at least it was an explanation. But my gut knew better. I kept walking. My breathing was faster now, but I controlled it, trying not to let the growing panic take over. I didn't want to look like I was fleeing. Predators, whether animal or human, pick up on fear. I pressed on, keeping my steps steady, my ears straining for movement behind me. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing at all. The unnatural silence of the forest pressed in around me. I turned a bend in the trail, my pulse hammering, and glanced back one last time. He was closer now. Still standing, still watching. I didn't even hear him move. That was the moment I abandoned all pretense of calm. I broke into a run. Not an all-out sprint. I didn't want to burn myself out, but a fast, steady pace. Enough to put distance between us. Enough to get back to a point where there might be other hikers. But the trail was empty. No one else had passed me all day. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded. Every time I glanced back, I expected to see him, but I never did. That was almost worse. The idea that he was still moving, still following, but silent. A sickening thought crept into my mind. What if he wasn't behind me at all? What if he had gone off trail, moving parallel to me, hidden by the trees, keeping pace in absolute silence? I ran faster. I wasn't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively. At this pace, it would take me at least an hour to reach the trailhead. 60 minutes in the fading daylight, with this thing, this man out there. I thought about stopping, about hiding, but that felt worse. I didn't know where he was, what he wanted. Stopping would make me vulnerable. I had no weapons, no cell service. My only chance was to keep moving. The light was dimming. Shadows stretched across the trail, making every movement in my peripheral vision seem like him. My breath was raw in my throat, my legs burned, but I kept pushing forward. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not loud, not crashing through the brush. Just soft, careful steps. Deliberate. Too close. I didn't look back. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, the cold air stabbing at my lungs. The trail blurred beneath me, my heartbeat drowning out everything else. Then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the trees. Not behind me. Ahead. I skidded to a stop, nearly losing my footing. The figure stepped forward. It was him. Somehow, impossibly, he was in front of me again. This time, he wasn't standing still. He moved. A slow step forward, then another. I did the only thing I could do. I ran off the trail. Straight into the trees, branches whipping against my face, my legs burning as I forced my way through the underbrush. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't let him get closer. I ran blindly, adrenaline overriding every rational thought, until finally, through the thinning trees, I saw something that nearly made me collapse from relief. A road. The logging road that led back to my car. I burst through the tree-line, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. I could see my car parked just up the road. But before I reached it, I forced myself to turn back. The forest was still. Empty. The man was gone. I didn't wait. I threw myself into my car, locked the doors, and sped away. I never went back to that trail. I never told anyone what happened. But even now, I can't stop wondering, if I had hesitated for even a second longer, what would he have done? I never used to be afraid of the woods. Growing up, I spent more nights camping under the stars than I did in my own bed. I loved the solitude, the fresh air, the way the trees whispered when the wind blew through them. That all changed after the night I saw it. The thing that made me question whether we really understand what lurks in the wilderness. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just me and two buddies, Chris and Mark. We chose a spot in West Virginia, miles from the nearest town. A dense forest, full of rocky overhangs and hidden clearings, perfect for getting lost in nature. We packed light, carried only the essentials, and hiked deep into the woods before setting up camp near a rocky outcrop that overlooked a small valley. The view was stunning, the kind that makes you forget how far you've walked. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we built a fire and settled in, swapping stories, passing around a flask, and enjoying the quiet. The world felt simple out there. No deadlines, no traffic, no noise except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, we heard the skittering. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the wind shifting through the trees. A soft, erratic scraping against stone. I glanced at Mark, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Chris must have heard it too, because he set his flask down and leaned forward listening. The sound came again, closer this time. A dry, clicking noise like nails dragging across rock. It came from beyond the fire's glow, just past the jagged rocks that marked the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon or a fox, but something about it made my skin prickle. Then it stopped. We waited, straining our ears, but there was only silence. After a few minutes, Chris chuckled, shook his head, and took another sip from the flask. "Relax," he said. "It's just the woods messing with us." Mark and I laughed, but it was forced. I could tell we were all a little on edge, though none of us wanted to admit it. The fire burned lower, the shadows stretched longer, and the forest around us seemed to hold its breath. Then it came again, faster this time. A scuttling, scraping sound, like something moving over stone on all fours. My stomach twisted. "All right," Mark muttered, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. "I'm checking it out." Chris and I followed, stepping cautiously toward the edge of the firelight. Mark swept the flashlight across the rocks, the beam bouncing off jagged surfaces and gnarled tree roots. Nothing. But I swear, just for a second, I saw something pale, something low to the ground, dart behind a boulder before disappearing into the darkness. Mark must have seen it too, because he let out a sharp breath and took a step back. "What the hell was that?" Chris laughed nervously. "Coyote, maybe?" "Coyotes don't move like that," I said. My voice sounded too tight, too small. We stood there for a long moment, scanning the trees, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. "Let's just go back to the fire," Chris finally said. "It's probably just a trick of the light." We nodded and retreated to our seats, but none of us were really at ease. The fire felt like a fragile barrier, the only thing separating us from whatever was out there. We kept our voices low, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. But deep down, I think we all knew better. The night stretched on. The fire would burn down to embers, and the cold started to creep in. Mark was the first to call it, tossing his sleeping bag out near the fire and crawling in. Chris followed, muttering something about how we were psyching ourselves out over nothing. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that pale shape darting just beyond the firelight, crouching low, waiting. My gut told me we weren't alone. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. Skitter. Click. Scrape. This time, it was right behind me. I went rigid, every muscle in my body locking up. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The fire had burned low, casting only a faint orange glow. My breath came in shallow gasps. I turned my head, slowly, carefully, not wanting to make a sound. And I saw it. A pale, human-like figure, crouched on all fours just at the edge of the clearing, watching me. Its limbs were too long, its fingers too thin, tipped with something dark and sharp. Its face was almost featureless. No nose, just deep, black eyes that stared directly into mine. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed up. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then, just as I thought I was about to pass out from sheer terror, it did something I'll never forget. It grinned. Not like a normal smile. No lips, just a slow, terrible stretch of skin, revealing a row of too small, too sharp teeth. Then it scuttled backward, fast, unnaturally fast, into the darkness, disappearing behind the rocks. I shot upright, gasping, scrambling to wake Chris and Mark. But by the time they groggily sat up, the thing was gone. "Dude, what the hell?" Chris mumbled, rubbing his eyes. I couldn't even speak. I just pointed toward the rocks, my hand shaking. Mark frowned, grabbed his flashlight, and swept it across the clearing. But there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. "Bad dream?" he asked. I shook my head violently. "No, it was real. I saw it." Chris sighed. "You're just tired, man." But I knew what I saw. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, staring at the darkness, waiting for that thing to come back. But it never did. By morning, I almost believed I had imagined it. Almost. But as we packed up to leave, I noticed something near the edge of the clearing, something that made my blood run cold. Long, clawed tracks, leading right up to where I had been sleeping. I never went back to that place again. I love hiking alone. Most people I know don't get it. They think it's reckless, but for me, being alone in nature is one of the few times I feel completely free. No phone, no emails, no noise, just me and the trail. This happened in Arizona, somewhere in the remote stretches of the Mogollon Rim. It was early spring, and I had planned a 3-day trek through an area I had never explored before. The weather was perfect, cool mornings, warm afternoons, and a clear sky stretching endlessly overhead. The first day was uneventful, exactly what I wanted. The trail was well-worn but empty. Not a single other hiker in sight. I set up camp on a small ridge overlooking a valley, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sunset as I sipped from my canteen. The solitude felt good. That night, I slept soundly, with only the distant sound of wind moving through the pines. No animals, no disturbances. It wasn't until the second day that things began to feel off. I was about 5 miles into the day's hike when I first heard it. A single, high-pitched whistle, coming from somewhere behind me. Not a tune, just one long, slow note, held for maybe 3 or 4 seconds. I stopped listening. Birds chirped. The wind rustled the trees. But the whistle didn't repeat. Probably nothing, I told myself. Could have been the wind, or maybe just my imagination. I kept moving. An hour later, I heard it again. Closer this time. Same long, deliberate note. I turned around quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sign of another hiker. But something about it, it felt intentional. Like it wasn't just some random sound, but meant for me to hear. I picked up my pace. By midday, I had stopped for lunch near a creek, sitting on a fallen log as I ate. The sun was high, warm against my skin, and for a moment, I let myself relax. Maybe it really was nothing. Then, just as I took a sip of water, whistle. I nearly choked. It was much closer this time, maybe within 100 feet. I stood up fast, scanning the trees. The forest was thick, with towering pines and dense underbrush. If someone was following me, they were staying well out of sight. I called out, "Hello." My voice felt small in the vast silence that followed. No answer. My instincts told me to leave. I wasn't scared yet, but something was wrong. I packed up quickly and got moving. That's when I heard the crunching of footsteps in the underbrush. They weren't heavy, but they were there. Slow, deliberate, keeping pace with me, but always just out of sight. I moved faster. The trail twisted through the trees, narrow in some places, opening into clearings in others. Every so often, I'd stop suddenly, trying to catch whoever it was off guard. Nothing. It wasn't until I reached a wide clearing that I got the first undeniable sign that I wasn't imagining this. I stepped into the open, walking toward the other side where the trail disappeared into the trees again. About halfway across, I stopped. Something was wrong. The forest ahead was too quiet. Then, as I stood there, frozen, whistle. It came from directly behind me. I turned so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. There was no one there, but the bushes were still moving. I ran. I didn't stop running for at least a mile. My pack was heavy, my lungs burned, but I didn't care. My body was moving before my brain even had time to process what I had seen, or more accurately, what I hadn't seen. By late afternoon, I reached a steep downhill stretch of the trail. It wound tightly through a ravine, the high rock walls on either side making it feel like I was being funneled into something. I hated it. I had two choices: make camp soon or push on and try to reach my car by nightfall. I checked my map. I was still at least 10 miles from the trailhead. If I hiked hard, I might make it before full dark. That's when I heard the whistling again, except this time, it wasn't behind me. It was ahead. Panic took over. I turned off the main trail, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to put distance between me and whoever, or whatever, was playing this game. Branches scratched at my face and arms. I stumbled but kept going. After what felt like forever, I finally stopped, gasping for breath. I listened. Nothing. For the first time in hours, silence. I sank to the ground, my legs shaking. I needed to rest, just for a minute. I needed to think. That's when I noticed the footprints. Not mine, someone else's. Fresh, and leading directly to where I was sitting. I felt my stomach drop. I had been herded here. I bolted. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to be away. The forest was darker now, the sun slipping below the ridgeline. My only focus was moving, pushing forward, not stopping. Then I saw it. A break in the trees. A road. I stumbled onto the asphalt, my legs barely able to keep me upright. Empty. No cars, no houses, just the end of the trail where I had parked that morning. My car was 100 yards away. I sprinted the last stretch, fumbled my keys, and threw myself inside, locking the doors behind me. My chest heaved. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the engine started. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back at the trailhead, and I swear to God, there was someone standing there. Not moving, not chasing, just watching, and I never heard the whistle again. I had always loved hiking alone. There was something about the solitude, the raw beauty of the wilderness, and the challenge of relying on nothing but my instincts and preparedness that made me feel truly alive. That particular autumn, I had taken time off work to do a solo trip in the Great Smoky Mountains. The plan was simple, a 3-day loop covering roughly 25 miles of well-maintained trails. It was something I had done before, nothing extreme, nothing dangerous. Or so I thought. The first day was uneventful. The forest was alive with the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the occasional burst of red and gold in the canopy above reminded me why I chose this time of year for my treks. I hiked at a steady pace, enjoying the silence, stopping only to take the occasional sip of water or adjust the straps on my pack. I set up camp near a small clearing just off the trail, cooked a simple meal over my small portable stove, and turned in early. That night, the forest was quiet. A light breeze rustled the leaves, an owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and the occasional snap of twigs under the weight of unseen animals reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. But it was all normal. It was the kind of quiet that put me at ease, rather than unnerved me. The next morning, I packed up my gear and set off at first light. The hike was easygoing, the air brisk. I followed the trail deeper into the forest, stopping at a scenic overlook to admire the valley below. It was around noon when I first noticed it. Footsteps. At first, I barely registered them. They were faint, distant. But after another half-mile or so, I realized they weren't fading away. They were constant, steady, following me. I stopped. The sound stopped. I turned, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing. Just the same quiet forest. Maybe I had imagined it. I had read once that the human brain, when deprived of regular sounds, could fill the silence with phantom noises. Maybe that was all this was. I took a deep breath and continued on. The footsteps started again. This time, I was paying closer attention. The cadence matched my own, like an echo, but it was delayed, just enough to be off. I stopped again. Silence. My heart rate picked up. I did a slow circle, checking for any sign of movement. The trees were dense, their trunks forming a thick wall of brown and green. If someone was there, they were either very well hidden or very still. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe another hiker was behind me, taking a break when I did. Maybe they were keeping their distance. It was possible, though I had seen no sign of anyone on the trail all morning. I kept moving. This time, I changed my pace. I sped up, then slowed down. The footsteps adjusted. That was when I knew. Someone, or something, was definitely there. A primal kind of fear took over, the kind that prickled at the back of my neck and tightened my chest. I picked up the pace, practically power walking down the trail. The footsteps followed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But my body wasn't convinced. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there. Another mile passed. The footsteps never wavered. By the time I reached a small stream crossing, my nerves were frayed. I crouched down, pretending to adjust my boot, and used the opportunity to scan my surroundings. The trail behind me was empty, but something felt off. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the leaves, were gone. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. That's when I saw it. A shape, just barely visible through the trees, standing still. Too still. My breath caught in my throat. It was about 50 yards back, partially obscured by branches. A person. A shadow. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but my gut told me to move. I stood and walked as calmly as I could, resisting the urge to sprint. I needed to keep my head. Running could turn this into a chase. If someone was following me, I didn't want to give them a reason to start. The footsteps resumed almost immediately. I walked faster. They kept up. After another 20 minutes, I came to a fork in the trail. I knew the left path led to a more remote section of the park, while the right would eventually loop back toward the main road. I hesitated for only a second before taking the right path. I needed to get back to my car, to civilization. For the first time in hours, the footsteps stopped. I listened. Silence. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe I had lost them, whoever they were. I kept moving, my pace brisk but steady. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the last thing I wanted was to be stuck out here after dark. Then, just as I started to feel safe, the footsteps returned. But this time they were faster. I broke into a run. My backpack thumped against my back. My breath came in ragged gasps. The trail blurred as I focused on one thing, getting the hell out of there. The footsteps were right behind me, closer than ever. I could hear them breathing. I veered off the trail, crashing through the underbrush. Thorns tore at my clothes, branches whipped my face, but I didn't stop. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air. Then silence. I collapsed against a tree, sucking in deep, ragged breaths. My ears strained for any sign of movement, but all I heard was the blood pounding in my head. Nothing. I waited 5 minutes. 10. The forest remained still. Cautiously, I crept back toward the trail. It was empty. No sign of anyone. No footprints, no rustling, no distant figure lurking in the trees. Like nothing had ever been there. I didn't question my luck. I walked, then jogged, then ran all the way back to the trailhead. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors behind me, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. But there was nothing. I never found out who, or what, was following me that day. Maybe it was just another hiker messing with me. Maybe it was my imagination. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Something was out there. And whatever it was, it didn't want to be seen. The hike was supposed to be just another weekend getaway, a break from the noise of the city, a breath of fresh mountain air, and a chance to reset my mind. My best friend, David, and I had planned it over a week ago, choosing a moderately challenging trail deep in the wilderness of Oregon. We'd both hiked plenty before, but this area was new to us, remote, quiet, perfect. We arrived in the late morning, parked at the small trailhead, and hoisted on our backpacks. The trail wound through thick pines and towering firs, sunlight streaming through in patches, dappling the earth with golden light. Birds called overhead, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush reminded us that we weren't alone. Just squirrels, maybe a deer if we were lucky. We set out at a relaxed pace, chatting about work, relationships, and the upcoming football season. Nothing felt out of place. If anything, the forest was peaceful. At least, at first. It started subtly. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not all at once, but gradually, like someone was dialing down the volume of the forest. Birds that had been chirping minutes ago were now gone. The wind in the trees stopped. Even our own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing sound. David noticed it too. "You hear that?" he asked, frowning. I nodded, scanning the trees. The trail had been well marked, but suddenly it seemed different. Narrower, almost as if we weren't on a designated path anymore. But that wasn't possible. We hadn't taken any turns, hadn't strayed off course. Weird, I muttered. Maybe just a dense patch? David shrugged, but he looked uneasy. We kept walking. Minutes passed, but the silence remained. It pressed against my ears, unnatural and heavy. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just psyching myself out. Then came the dizziness. It hit us both at the same time. One moment we were walking, and the next, I felt like my head had been plunged underwater. My vision wavered. My balance faltered. The world around me seemed to tilt, just for a second. I stopped and put a hand on my knee. Whoa, David was doing the same. You feel that? Yeah, like I just stood up too fast. The air felt thick, almost charged with static electricity. The trees around us seemed taller, darker, though that didn't make any sense. I rubbed my temples, willing the dizziness to pass. And then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. The forest was normal again. The sounds returned, birds chirping, leaves rustling. But something was off. David checked his watch. Then his face twisted in confusion. Dude, tell me I'm crazy. I glanced at my own watch and felt my stomach drop. We had lost 15 minutes. Not a minute. Not 2. 15 full minutes were just gone. What the hell? I whispered. David shook his head. I don't know. We didn't stop. We didn't black out. We were just walking. And now, it's 15 minutes later. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. My heart was pounding. I tried to reason through it. Maybe our watches were wrong. Maybe we had been so deep in conversation that we miscounted time. But no, this wasn't just forgetting a few minutes. This was something else. Something that made my skin crawl. We pushed forward, trying to shake the unease, but the forest felt different now. Every shadow seemed darker. Every sound sharper. My body felt normal, but my mind couldn't shake the sense that something was watching us. Then we found the footprints. At first, I thought they were ours, hiking boots, deep impressions in the soft earth. But then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There were more prints than there should have been. David saw it too. He crouched down, tracing the edges of the indentations with his fingers. These aren't ours. He was right. The extra prints weren't quite the same shape as our boots. They were narrower, longer, almost like they had been made by bare feet. And the worst part, they walked in circles around our own prints. Something had been following us. Something we never saw. I swallowed hard. We need to leave. David nodded. Yeah, now. We turned back, moving quickly, but not running. The trees felt closer than before. The air still carried that static charge, making the hair on my arms stand up. And then, from behind us, came a sound that froze me in my tracks. A whisper. Not words. Just a sound. A breath, a sigh. Something that shouldn't have been there. David's face went pale. He heard it too. We started moving faster. My pulse hammered in my ears. The sound didn't repeat, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left. When we finally reached the car, I barely waited for David to get inside before slamming the doors shut and locking them. Only then did I realize I was shaking. We drove in silence for a long time. Finally, David spoke. We don't talk about this. I exhaled. Agreed. But even now, years later, I still think about that hike. About the silence, the dizziness, the missing time. And worst of all, the footprints. Something else had been there with us that day. And whatever it was, it knew we were there too. I've done a lot of solo camping in my life. It's something I enjoy, getting away from everything, feeling the quiet of the wilderness, the simple routine of setting up a camp, making a fire, cooking, and then just listening to the sounds of nature. I've never been afraid of the woods, never been the type to psych myself out with horror stories or let my imagination run wild. I always thought I was too rational for that. But one trip changed the way I feel about being alone in the dark forever. It was early autumn, just cool enough at night to make a campfire feel nice. I had planned a 2-night trip into the Appalachian wilderness, hiking in about 10 miles to a remote spot I had marked on a map months before. It was the kind of place where you were almost guaranteed not to see another person the entire time. That was the appeal. No other campers, no man-made noises, just me and nature. I parked my truck at the trailhead, hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, and started the trek. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were my boots crunching leaves and the occasional bird call. It took me a good 5 hours to reach the spot, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by thick trees. I set up camp methodically. Tent up, sleeping bag unrolled, firewood gathered. By the time the sun started setting, I had a good fire going. I cooked a simple meal, sat back against a log, and just listened. The forest was alive in a way that felt peaceful. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. It was around midnight when I decided to turn in. I let the fire die down to embers, crawled into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I slept before something woke me. A sound, not the normal sounds of the forest, not the wind or an animal moving in the distance. This was close, soft, deliberate. Footsteps. At first, I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. But then I heard it again, slow, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. I held my breath, listening. I could feel my heartbeat picking up, my body tense, waiting. The footsteps stopped directly behind me, where the thin nylon of my tent was stretched taut. The only thing between me and whatever was out there was a millimeter of fabric. I swallowed, my mouth dry. Then, something even worse happened. Breathing. Not the quick snorts of a deer, not the sniffing of an animal. This was human breathing, slow, deep, steady. Someone was standing outside my tent, just standing there, breathing. I reached slowly for my flashlight. My hand trembled as I clicked it on. The moment the beam cut through the darkness, the breathing stopped. I sat up, trying to aim the light through the thin fabric of the tent. Nothing. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my half-asleep brain had misinterpreted the wind. Then I heard it again. A single footstep. I turned the flashlight off, not wanting to give away my exact position inside the tent. I strained to listen. The night was dead silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping my flashlight, heart hammering. But eventually, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I lay back down, still holding the flashlight, and forced my breathing to slow. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I woke up with a jolt. Something was wrong. The air inside the tent felt thick, suffocating. I turned onto my side, groggy, and then I saw them. Two eyes, reflecting the faint light of the moon, staring at me from outside the tent. They were high up, too high to be an animal. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I froze. My mind scrambled for an explanation. A trick of the light, a reflection? But no, they were there. I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me. I slowly reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I didn't want to make a sound, didn't want to provoke whatever, or whoever, was standing there. Minutes passed. The eyes didn't move, just stared. Then, as if breaking a spell, they disappeared. Just gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, listening for any sign of movement. The forest stayed silent. When the first light of dawn broke, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped outside. My breath was visible in the crisp morning air. The clearing looked normal, undisturbed, peaceful, like nothing had happened. But then I saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. They circled my tent twice, then stopped directly in front of where my head had been. I packed up in record time, my hands shaking. I didn't eat, didn't take a break. Just shoved everything into my pack and started the hike back. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, panting, my legs burning from the pace I'd kept. As I threw my pack into the back seat, I turned for one last look at the trail. There, standing at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Watching me. I got in my truck and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was out there that night. But I do know one thing. I've never gone solo camping again. And I never will. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A solo backpacking trip into the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana. 5 days of complete solitude, fresh air, and endless miles of untouched forest. I had always loved being alone in the wild. Something about it made me feel sharper, more in tune with everything around me. I had planned my route carefully. A long loop that would take me deep into the wilderness and then back toward the trailhead where my truck was parked. I had my pack loaded with everything I needed: tent, food, bear spray, my hunting knife, and a small handgun for emergencies. Not that I ever expected to need it. Day one went by smoothly. The weather was cool but not too cold, and I made good time, covering nearly 12 miles before setting up camp near a stream. I cooked a simple meal, drank some coffee, and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. I woke up early the next morning, broke camp, and kept moving. The trail became more rugged, winding through dense patches of pine and crossing a few rocky inclines. By midday, I reached a clearing that overlooked a deep valley, stretching for miles in either direction. The view was breathtaking, but that's when I saw it. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. There was something hanging from a tree about 20 yards off the trail. My first thought was that it was a fallen branch caught in the limbs. But as I moved closer, I realized it was something else entirely. A deer, strung up by its back legs, its body hanging upside down from a thick tree limb. I stopped in my tracks. Something about it felt wrong. The deer's throat had been slit cleanly, but there was no blood. Its body looked almost drained. The way it was hanging didn't look like a hunter's kill. It wasn't skinned or gutted. It just dangled there, its lifeless eyes staring at nothing. A shiver ran through me. I had seen my fair share of dead animals in the wild, but this was different. I stepped closer, looking around for any signs of human activity. No footprints, no drag marks, no signs of a camp nearby. The more I stared at the deer, the more uneasy I felt. This wasn't normal. I wasn't sure what to do. It wasn't illegal to hunt out here, but there were proper ways to do it. This wasn't one of them, and the fact that the deer had no visible wounds apart from the slit throat made my stomach churn. I glanced at the ground beneath it. Dry, not a drop of blood anywhere. Something wasn't right. I decided to keep moving. The longer I stood there, the worse the feeling got, like I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I camped that night near a small lake, but I didn't sleep well. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the brush put me on edge. I kept replaying the image of the deer in my head. There was no logical explanation for it, at least none that sat right with me. The next morning, I packed up quickly and hit the trail again. The plan was to loop around and start heading back toward my truck. I kept my pace steady, trying to enjoy the scenery and push the unease from my mind. But by midday, the feeling was back. It started as a vague sense of unease, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. At first, I told myself I was just spooked from the deer. But as I hiked deeper into the forest, that feeling only got stronger. I wasn't alone. I stopped multiple times, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Just silence. But I knew someone was there. I changed my route slightly, cutting off the main trail and moving through denser trees. If someone was following me, I wanted to see if they'd do the same. About a mile later, I stopped again. Waited. Nothing. Maybe I was being paranoid. I kept moving, but the feeling never fully went away. The next morning, I woke up to a heavy mist covering the ground. It gave everything an eerie, muted look. The air was damp and cold, and I felt stiff as I packed up my gear. I was only a day's hike from my truck now. If I pushed hard, I could make it out by nightfall. By noon, the mist had burned off, but my unease hadn't. I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking the trees. And then I saw it. Another deer, hanging from a tree, identical to the first. My stomach twisted into knots. I forced myself to move closer, scanning the ground, the trees, everything. No tracks, no signs of blood, no sign of whoever was doing this. What were the odds of stumbling upon two dead deer strung up like that, miles apart? This wasn't coincidence. Someone was out here, and they wanted me to know it. I picked up my pace, moving as quickly as I could without running. I didn't want to be out here any longer than necessary. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs ached, my shoulders burned from carrying my pack, and my nerves were fried. I checked my map, only a few more miles to go. That's when I heard it. A whistle. Sharp. Clear. Not a bird, not an animal. A person. I froze, my heart pounding. It had come from somewhere up ahead, just beyond the bend in the trail. I waited, listening. Silence. I pulled my knife from its sheath, gripping it tightly as I moved forward. Every step felt like I was walking straight into a trap. Then I saw them. 3 figures standing in the trees, about 50 yards away. Not moving, just standing, watching. They were dressed in dark clothing, partially hidden by the trees. I couldn't make out their faces. My blood turned to ice. I took a slow step back. They didn't move. Then, one of them raised their hand. Not in a wave, not in a greeting. Just a slow, deliberate motion. That was enough. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran, branches whipping against my face, lungs burning. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, jumped inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I floored it down the dirt road, not looking in the rearview mirror until I was miles away. There was nothing there, but I knew what I saw, and I knew I'd never come back. I never reported it. What would I say? That I saw some deer strung up in the woods and got a bad feeling? That some strangers stood in the trees and watched me? No laws were broken. No crime was committed. But I know what I saw, and I know someone or something was out there, watching, waiting. I don't hike alone anymore. Hiking alone in the Rockies had always been a dream of mine. Something about the raw, untouched wilderness, the crisp mountain air, and the complete solitude. I had done countless solo hikes before, but nothing as remote as this. I planned a 5-day trek through an area that few ventured into, far from well-traveled paths and crowded campsites. Just me, my backpack, and miles of untouched forest. I started early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the jagged peaks. The first day was uneventful, just miles of winding trails, towering pines, and the occasional distant call of an unseen bird. By evening, I set up camp near a small, pristine lake. The water was still, reflecting the last hues of daylight, and the air had that fresh, almost electric scent of pine and earth. After a simple meal, I crawled into my tent and listened to the sounds of the wilderness as I drifted off to sleep. The tapping woke me up. At first, I thought it was a dream, just some half-remembered sound carrying over from whatever I had been dreaming about. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, almost delicate, like fingertips lightly drumming on the fabric of my tent. My first thought was that it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind. But there was no wind. The air was completely still, heavy with the silence of deep night. I held my breath, listening. Nothing moved outside. No rustling leaves, no crunching undergrowth. Just the tapping. I reached for my flashlight, the small beam cutting through the darkness as I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The trees stood motionless, their dark forms stretching toward the sky. The ground was undisturbed. No sign of an animal, no fallen branches, nothing that could have caused the sound. I let the tent flap fall back into place, zipped it shut, and lay back down. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it had been some tiny animal scurrying past. I closed my eyes and tried to relax. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, closer. A shiver ran down my spine. It was deliberate, not random, not natural. I gripped my knife, my heartbeat thudding against my ribs. For what felt like hours, I lay there, every muscle tense, waiting. But eventually the tapping stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, I had convinced myself that it had been nothing. A trick of the mind, exhaustion playing games with my senses. I packed up camp and pushed forward, deeper into the wilderness. The second day's hike was more grueling, steeper inclines, rougher terrain. By late afternoon, I had reached a secluded valley, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. I set up camp in a clearing, surrounded on 3 sides by thick forest and on the 4th by a sheer rock face. It felt safe, enclosed. As night fell, I forced myself to ignore the unease creeping into my mind. I ate, read a little from the book I'd brought, then settled in for the night, determined to get some real rest. Then, just past midnight, tap, tap, tap. I sat up so fast I nearly knocked over my lantern. My breath caught in my throat. Tap, tap, tap. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. It was outside my tent. I clenched my knife and carefully reached for my flashlight. My fingers were shaking as I clicked it on. The tent's thin fabric glowed under the beam, but it revealed nothing beyond. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The clearing was empty. The trees loomed in the distance, their branches still and lifeless. I shone the light across the perimeter of my camp, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was nothing, but then I noticed something new. A single, small stone sat just outside my tent. It hadn't been there before. My stomach twisted. Had someone placed it there? Was someone messing with me? I listened, every nerve in my body on edge, but the night was silent. I pulled the stone inside and stared at it for a long time before finally setting it aside and forcing myself to lie back down. I barely slept. I should have turned back. Every instinct told me to. But I was 2 days in, and my stubbornness wouldn't let me quit. I pressed on. That night, I camped near an old, gnarled tree at the edge of a deep ravine. The terrain was harsher here, the landscape shifting into something more primal, more ancient. I had barely settled in when it started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time I was ready. I snapped on my flashlight, knife in hand, and ripped open the tent. The beam swept across the darkness. Nothing, just the empty, silent forest. But then, a shadow moved between the trees. Quick, too quick, like a flicker in the corner of my vision. I whipped my flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing there. The trees stood silent, unmoving. I strained my ears, but the night remained eerily quiet. Then I saw it. The stone. Another one, placed right outside my tent. Something was out here. Something was watching me. I grabbed the stone and hurled it into the darkness, listening as it clattered against the trees. Then I backed into my tent, zipped it up, and gripped my knife with white-knuckled fingers. The tapping didn't return that night, but I didn't sleep a second. I sat awake, listening, waiting. By the 4th day, I had had enough. I decided to cut my trip short and head back. I pushed hard, covering as much ground as possible. By nightfall, I was exhausted, but I refused to stop until I was too tired to be afraid. I found a clearing and set up camp one last time. That night, I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, gripping my knife. I was done playing games. The wind picked up, rustling the branches. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the trees. Then, just beyond the light's edge, I saw it. A figure. It stood just beyond the fire's glow, still as a statue. I could barely make out its shape. A person? Or something else? My mouth went dry. Tap, tap, tap. My blood turned to ice. The figure didn't move. It didn't step forward, didn't retreat. Just stood there, tapping on something unseen. I reached for my flashlight, my heart pounding against my ribs. The moment I switched it on, the figure was gone. Just like that, as if it had never been there at all. I packed up my gear and ran. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I didn't stop, didn't rest until I saw the first light of dawn breaking over the mountains. By noon, I was back at my car. Safe, but the feeling never left me. That unnerving sense that something had followed me, watched me, waited for me. To this day, I don't know what it was. I only know that I will never go back there again.